Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is going to be fascinating. We're tackling mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptors today.
Two very similar names, but different functions.
Yeah, our listener wants to know how these receptors are involved in, like, salt balance, the stress response, and even inflammation.
We've even got some medication side effects thrown in the mix.
Oh, yeah, can't forget about those.
It's a lot to cover, and it really is like different pieces of a puzzle. We've got a dense academic text, but thankfully a YouTube video transcript that might help us visualize things.
Ooh, visuals are always helpful. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, before we jump in, I think it's worth emphasizing that this isn't just some abstract textbook stuff.
Right.
This is about how your body actually works on a fundamental level.
Okay, so let's start with something we can all relate to. The stress response.
Cortisol.
Cortisol, that's the big player here, right?
It is. So picture this. You encounter a stressful situation.
Like running late for a meeting.
Exactly. Your body releases cortisol. It's like a chemical messenger, and it rushes to these specific receptors in your cells called glucocorticoid receptors.
Okay, so cortisol is like sending out an SOS, and the glucocorticoid receptors are the ones picking up the signal.
That's a great analogy.
So what happens next?
Well, this binding, it triggers a whole cascade of events inside the cell. One of the main things is it suppresses inflammation.
So basically, cortisol is telling the immune system to chill out for a bit.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like hitting the brakes on the immune system so it doesn't go into overdrive when you're dealing with stress.
Makes sense. You don't want your body attacking itself when it's already dealing with something stressful.
Exactly. But there's a twist.
Uh-oh, I don't like twists.
Cortisol can actually bind to another type of receptor, too.
No way. So there's like...
It's called the mineralocorticoid receptor, and it's usually involved in regulating salt balance.
Wait, so cortisol can bind to two different receptors. What happens when it binds to the mineralocorticoid receptor?
Well, that's where things can get a bit tricky.
Oh, no.
Because, see, the mineralocorticoid receptor is usually activated by aldosterone. That's a hormone that tells your kidneys to hold on to sodium.
Okay, so aldosterone is like the sodium saver.
Exactly. But when cortisol binds to this receptor, it can kind of mimic aldosterone's effects.
So more sodium retention.
Yeah, and that can be a problem.
So we'd basically be walking salt shakers.
Well, not exactly. Thankfully, our bodies are smarter than that.
Oh, thank goodness.
We have this built-in mechanism to prevent cortisol from constantly activating those mineralocorticoid receptors.
Okay, how does that work?
In tissues where these receptors are abundant, like the kidneys, there's this special enzyme. It converts cortisol into a less active form.
It's just like a bodyguard, making sure only the right hormone gets through.
Exactly. It's like a bouncer at an exclusive club, only letting aldosterone in.
Love that analogy. So that keeps everything in check.
Yep. Pretty neat system, huh?
Our bodies are incredible.
Mm.
Okay, let's take a break from these two receptors for a minute. All right. You mentioned a YouTube video earlier, something about the glycine receptor.
Yes. Now, this video doesn't directly talk about mineralocorticoid or glucocorticoid receptors.
But it's still relevant.
But it does give us this really helpful visual analogy for understanding how receptors work in general. And that's relevant to all receptors.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the video describes the glycine receptor as having these three distinct states. It's like a gate that can be open, closed, or what they call desensitized.
A gate.
Yeah, it controls the flow of information, sort of like those channels we were talking about earlier.
Right.
And this concept applies beautifully to our mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptors, too.
Okay, so how does the gate analogy work with these receptors?
When cortisol binds to the glucocorticoid receptor, it's like the gate swings open, setting off a chain reaction. But if the gate stays open for too long,
things get out of whack.
the receptor can become desensitized or less responsive. It's like the gate gets stuck.
So it's like the receptor saying, enough already with the cortisol.
Pretty much. It's a way to prevent overstimulation.
Makes sense. Our bodies are so good at self-regulating.
It's truly remarkable.
Okay, let's bring in the big guns now. What does the academic text say about all of this?
Now things get really interesting. The text dives into how these receptors actually influence which genes are turned on or off.
Wait, what? They can do that?
Oh, yeah. These receptors don't just sit there on the cell surface. They travel all the way to the nucleus where your DNA is stored.
Whoa. So they're like VIPs, getting backstage access to the control center.
Exactly. And once they're there, they act like switches, turning genes on or off.
I did not know receptors had that much power.
It's pretty amazing. And this gene regulation, it ultimately dictates which proteins are produced in the cell.
So they're like the master chefs, deciding what's on the protein menu.
I love that analogy.
This is mind-blowing.
Right, and the consequences of this gene regulation are huge. It can affect everything from your metabolism to your immune response. Pretty powerful stuff, huh?
No kidding. Okay, this is all so fascinating, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. There's so much more to uncover.
And I'm ready to dive deeper.
For example, in the kidneys, aldosterone, through the mineralocorticoid receptor, it increases the production of proteins that are involved in sodium transport.
So it's like fine-tuning the amount of sodium our body reabsorbs.
Exactly. Prevents us from losing too much sodium through urine.
A molecular sodium regulator. What about glucocorticoid receptors? What kind of genes do they target?
Well, they have a lot of targets, but one way that cortisol exerts its anti-inflammatory effects is by actually suppressing the production of cytokines.
Cytokines?
Yeah, those are the chemical messengers that promote inflammation.
Got it. So cortisol's like, hold on, immune system, let's not overreact.
Precisely. And then there are the genes involved in metabolism, how our bodies process energy.
Okay, see, this is what I'm interested in. Stress and eating habits, totally linked for me. Is that cortisol messing with my metabolism?
It's possible. Cortisol, acting through the glucocorticoid receptor, can actually stimulate the liver to produce glucose.
So that explains those sugar cravings when I'm stressed.
Yeah, it's like your body is prepping for a fight or flight response, even if the stressor is just a work deadline.
Fascinating. But if it's chronic, like long-term stress?
Then yeah, chronically elevated cortisol can lead to problems like metabolic disorders.
Oh, okay, back to the research stuff.
Oh.
The text mentions using something called cDNA microarrays to study gene expression. What are those?
Oh, those are cool. Imagine a tiny chip, really small, like smaller than your fingernail.
Okay, tiny chip.
And it's covered in thousands of microscopic spots.
Lots of what?
DNA. Each spot has DNA from a specific gene.
So it's like a mini gene library on a chip.
Exactly. Researchers then take RNA from cells. Remember, RNA is like the messenger molecule that carries instructions from DNA.
RNA, the blueprint.
Exactly. They label this RNA with a fluorescent tag.
Okay.
And they wash it over the microarray. The RNA molecules will bind to their matching DNA sequence on the chip.
So the RNA is like searching for its soulmate gene.
That's a great way to put it. And then a special scanner detects that fluorescent signal. It shows which genes are active and how active they are.
Wow, so you can actually see which genes are being expressed, like a gene activity map.
Precisely. And this technique, it's super useful for understanding how cells respond to different signals, like hormones or even drugs.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, what about chromatin immunoprecipitation? That was another term in the text that threw me off.
Chromatin immunoprecipitation, or ChIP, it helps pinpoint exactly where on the DNA a particular protein is binding.
Wait, so we can actually see where a protein is interacting with DNA?
Yep. Uses antibodies.
Okay.
Antibodies are like these molecular hooks, incredibly specific. They latch onto a target protein like our mineralocorticoid or glucocorticoid receptor.
Yeah.
They pull out the receptor and whatever DNA it's bound to from the cell.
So it's like fishing for specific receptors and seeing what they're attached to.
Exactly. Then researchers can analyze that DNA to see exactly where the receptor was bound. Gives us a very precise location.
Amazing. Okay, all of this is super cool, but I want to talk about real-world applications. How do these receptors, and what we know about them, impact our health?
That's the million-dollar question.
And the reason we're all here, right?
Exactly. And this is where things get really clinically relevant. So think about mineralocorticoid receptors for a sec. They're key for regulating salt and water balance, right?
Right, like we talked about earlier.
But what happens if those receptors aren't working properly?
Uh-oh, trouble.
Trouble indeed. It can lead to things like hypertension, high blood pressure.
Oh, wow, that's serious. So if the receptors aren't doing their job.
Exactly. The delicate balance of electrolytes in the body gets thrown off, and that impacts blood pressure.
Makes sense. What about problems with glucocorticoid receptors?
Oh, that can contribute to a whole bunch of issues. Think metabolic disorders like diabetes or inflammatory diseases.
And I think I remember reading something about mental health conditions too, right?
You're right. Even things like depression have been linked to glucocorticoid receptor dysfunction. It's really quite remarkable how widespread their effects are.
It is. So we've got these two receptors, One is involved in salt balance and the other in inflammation and the stress response,
Hmm.
but both can cause major problems if they're not working correctly.
Right. And to illustrate that, think about Cushing syndrome. That's a condition where there's an overproduction of cortisol,
Too much cortisol.
way too much. And it leads to all sorts of symptoms.
Hmm.
Weight gain, muscle weakness, mood swings. The list goes on.
Yikes. So it's all about balance then. What happens when there's not enough cortisol?
That's a problem too. Think Addison's disease. Insufficient cortisol production leads to fatigue, low blood pressure, and can even become life-threatening.
Wow, it really highlights how finely tuned our bodies are and how much we rely on these intricate systems to keep everything running smoothly.
It's a delicate dance.
Okay, so we've talked about what happens when things go wrong. But how are these receptors targeted in treatments?
Good question. You've probably heard of corticosteroids, right?
Yeah, I've heard of those. They're prescribed for things like asthma and arthritis.
Exactly. They're synthetic drugs that mimic the action of cortisol. They bind to glucocorticoid receptors and reduce inflammation.
So they're like stand-ins for cortisol, helping to calm down the immune system.
Precisely. But remember that whole cross-reactivity thing we discussed earlier, where cortisol can bind to both types of receptors?
Ooh, right.
Well, corticosteroids can do that too. That's why they sometimes cause side effects like fluid retention and increased blood pressure.
Makes sense. So it's like the medication is hitting two targets instead of one.
Yep. And that's why researchers are always looking for ways to develop more selective drugs, drugs that only bind to the intended receptor.
Like a key that only fits one specific lock.
Perfect analogy. That's the goal. Minimize side effects, maximize treatment effectiveness.
Okay, this has all been super informative, but I'm also curious about the research side of things. What are scientists doing to study these receptors in more detail?
Great question. We've already touched on some of the techniques they use, like cDNA microarrays and chromatin immunoprecipitation.
Right, those were mind-blowing. But are there any other cool tools they're using?
Oh, absolutely. One that's really exciting is optogenetics.
Up to what?
Optogenetics. It sounds like something out of Star Trek, but it's real. It basically combines genetics and optics.
Okay, not sure I'm following.
Researchers can actually control the activity of specific cells using light.
Hold on, control cells with light. How?
By introducing a light-sensitive proteins into those cells. They act like tiny switches that can be turned on or off with different colors of light.
That's incredible, like installing a remote control system in the cells. So they can use this to study these receptors in action.
Exactly. They can observe how the receptors respond to different signals, how they interact with other proteins, all in real time. It's like watching a live performance of what's happening at the molecular level.
That is mind-blowing. Science is so amazing.
It is. And these advancements are really giving us incredible insight into how our bodies work.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I have to say, I'm feeling a little bit smarter.
Me too.
But in all seriousness, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for sending such a great question. We hope you learned a thing or two about mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptors. Until next time, stay curious.